Dog Joe Giacalone. Joe, how are you?
Good, Josh. Good to see you back on Sunday.
Back on Sunday. We've got a great show today because we're talking to the man behind one of the companies that's helping to solve some of the biggest cold cases in the country. David Mittelman, the founder of Othram, is here. And we're going to get into how DNA is actually being used in cases like the Long Island serial killer and why, in some cases like Nancy Guthrie, it still may not be enough. David, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, wonderful. Before we dive in, just a couple of quick things. This week, we're going to be putting out two interviews. One we did back in 2015 with Vernon Geberth, NYPD detective and forensic expert. And the guy literally wrote the book on murder, the Practical Homicide Investigation Handbook. We're going to talk to him about his profile of LISK from back in 2015. And I'll tell you, by the way, Joe, this is interesting. Vernon was right on the money.
Yeah, Vernon, long time. I've known him for a long time.
Of course. We're also releasing an interview with Lorraine Ella, who is the mother of Megan Waterman. Lorraine has since passed away, but it's really powerful to hear her perspective on what happened way back when. There was also a pretrial hearing in the Rex Heuermann case last week. So, Joe, what were your takeaways from that hearing?
Yeah, big nothing burger for those of us that thought we were going to get into the motions. But he has another court date on April 8th. Crutches and all, apparently. So we'll see what happens then.
What do you make of the crutches?
I don't know. I'm getting the Harvey Weinstein vibes over here, and the Joe D'Angelo out in Golden State.
I mean, look, the dude's 300 pounds. So, also the fact that he's not moving around, you got to assume he's in horrible health. He didn't eat well. So, I do wonder, being stuck in a cell all day long, 23 hours, whether his body is starting to kind of break down.
We shall see. We'll hear some more. I guess Michael Brown will tell us.
Yes. All right. Let's get back to today's guest. It is a true honor to have David here with us because what his company is doing is fundamentally changing how crimes get solved, whether it's active cases like Kohlberger or some of the coldest cases. We're talking Lady of the Dunes, Ruth Marie Terry, Boy in the Box, Joseph Zarelli. And he's giving these victims back the one thing their killer could never take away, their names. So, David, let's start here. For people who may not understand what Othram is doing, how is your lab doing differently that it's able to solve cases that other labs can't?
Sure, yeah, and it's more than just labs. So just to take a step back, when you look at forensics over the last, say 30 years, forensics is premised on matching. So the way it works, a lot of these forensic techniques is that you've got a hypothesis, you might have a suspect in mind, and you're looking to see if you can confirm or develop enough evidence that this person was at the crime scene. So you might be matching a shoe print or a fingerprint. You might be matching a DNA profile that you get from a suspect that might also be in a database like CODIS that the government runs. So forensics is premised on matching. And so the question you're asking is, were you at the crime scene? The question that we're asking and the technology that we're building allows people to ask, whose DNA is this? This is actually a very different question. So instead of matching, instead of needing a suspect in advance, instead of needing a hypothesis, you can just simply see where the data leads and what you find. And then if you can build the infrastructure, because yes, we have a lab that offers service, but that's really a small set of what we're doing is we're actually building infrastructure. We're deploying the physical equipment, the software, the reagents, the tools to let all public labs start doing this. And several have signed on just this year alone. Like we're eventually going to bring this technology to every public lab. If you can do it this way, where you don't need matching, where you don't need a reference, then it really opens up a whole new world of investigative possibilities. And just to give you like a concrete example, when you come to a crime scene, for example, like in this Nancy Guthrie case, what's the first thing that the law enforcement did? One of the first things they did is they look at the cameras and they're like, is there a doorbell cam? Is there a street cam? Like what video feeds exist? And that's because the video may not always identify someone, but it's recorded visually who was there, and you can basically look at it on day zero. You don't use the video feed to confirm a suspicion. You just look to see what's on the video feed. That's how DNA in kind of the era of Othram is going to work. is going to work. So now DNA is like a camera. DNA is your identity feed. Just like a camera, the DNA is recording who was there, the identities of people, not the images, of course. And so when you come to a crime scene, in our view of how things would work, the very first thing you would do is check the camera feed and check the DNA feed. Grab all the DNA, not just the one piece of DNA that was on this one item that you think might have been the weapon, the cigarette butts, whatever's on the floor. Like, pick up all the DNA, figure out who was there, determine who is likely to have been involved or not involved, what DNA goes to the suspect, what DNA might go to the victim, all that kind of stuff, and learn up front what information you've got available, because that can really shorten the time it takes to investigate. It's very different than the way forensics has been, which is using DNA at the very end of the investigation to confirm a hunch or a suspicion.
I've heard your name throughout the list case, and you've become, to be honest, a god in solving these cases. Seriously, what made you get into this? Like, what was the process?
Well, I will tell you, Othram is a very mission-driven organization. We're probably more mission-driven than a lot of the mission-driven nonprofits out there, and we're really big on advocacy. And a lot of us, including my family, have firsthand experienced the consequences of crime, of people doing terrible things, and not getting the answers, in some cases ever, about what happened. And it's an intolerable thing to feel if you've been able to be exposed to it firsthand. And that intolerance, towards unresolved crime and lack of accountability has really driven us. And so there's a lot of people at our company. We have about 100 now, and we've got AI engineers, top computer scientists, folks that could make tons of money doing tons of things at a whole bunch of other companies, and they're here at Othram, in a field that generally people don't jump into to make a quick buck, and it's because they really believe what I just told you earlier, which is that we're at the cusp. What you see is a lot of cases being solved. And yes, we have a phenomenal lab. We can work DNA that no other lab can work. We've got technology that can read through things that no one else can read through. And we've largely automated a lot of the process of even identifying and doing genetic genealogy. I mean, people are doing genetic genealogy manually. We've moved into like the hyperspace of AI and other tools to help resolve things a lot quicker. But the real exciting part is that we're on the cusp of a shift, a seismic shift in how criminal justice works. And so it's that personal experience and just like the firsthand feeling of what it's like to be at the epicenter of that, which drives a lot of the people at Othram. And we continue to recruit people that way. The people that founded this company, the founding team, had that mission in mind. And to this day, we continue to hire people, ex-law enforcement, advocates, victims, families of victims. And that's how we keep the company going. And that's what gets us up in the morning every day.
It
Dave,
shows.
when you get a case from law enforcement that you are going to do this, how often have you found as you're going through these cases that the DNA existed in these cases for decades, and it's like almost as if like they just discovered it all of a sudden?
It's almost every time. I mean, there's tons of DNA. Most of these cases are, they have DNA. Sometimes the DNA has been read and passed through CODIS, and there's no match in CODIS because, like we talked about, CODIS is like the phone book. It's like a lookup table. If you're not in the system, you can't be found, which is very terrible if you're, for example, someone that has died. If you're a victim, which is why our company puts such an emphasis on the human remains problem. That's why we work with NamUs. We've been a vendor with NamUs for years now. We're clearing out as much as we can because why would these victims even be in CODIS in the first place? But even crimes, the New York Times reported last summer, it's a coin flips toss if you're going to get caught for murdering someone, and you even have better odds of escaping justice if you just simply sexually assault someone. So this is a huge issue, and it really drives the need for a different way of doing things.
And I just want to follow it up. Sorry, Josh,
Yeah.
but you had the Barbara Waldman case, which was like the first kind of sexual assault case I see you guys come out with in regards to this. But now you're getting basically what I call the trilogy: unidentified human remains, old SA cases, and homicide victims. So I mean, this is kind of exciting in that respect.
There's tons of these sex. You bring up a good point. Like people had historically started with homicides and human remains, but there are tons of sex assaults. Right now, we're in court in Maine, and we're involved in the prosecution of the very first sex assault that is being prosecuted using forensic genetic genealogy.
Oh,
So it's
cool.
one other detail we could talk about later, but it's not just about finding the person using software, AI, and laboratory technology to make it easier and more likely to find them, but then doing it in a way that can be audited, interrogated, and defended in court. And we've brought FGG to court more than any company on this earth, and we try to go to court. Not because we want to dress up nice and sit on the stand, but it's important to get to court to discuss this, to make sure the prosecutors feel comfortable discussing this in court, to make sure that defense teams understand what's going on as well and feel comfortable interrogating it. Because until that happens, it's hard to bring this technology to everyone. But I just want to say, I had made a comment in an earlier talk. I told the audience, like, from my perspective, a lot of these cases, the unsolved status of these cases, unsolved crime, is a choice because there is DNA. It's been sitting there, and whether it's been analyzed or not analyzed, like we should take out all the cases. Is there a case that doesn't have DNA and literally cannot be solved? Sure, but that's not that edge example is not a reason to say, oh, I guess we're not going to work on any sex assaults or homicides because there could be one that doesn't have DNA. Most of them have DNA, and the evidence is, as Joe said, this woman, she was the wife of a dentist, and assaulted and murdered, and I think they for a while suspected the husband, and the family got no justice, and it took decades. And if we were able to do it now, we probably could have done it, probably not decades ago, but at least we've been around for 7 years now, 8 years. So we've been around for a while. Like this, there's no excuse anymore. These cases should be worked, and all the DNA that has been looked at, whether it's been looked at using an old technology or never before, should be reinterrogated, and we should just clear these cases, especially while the families are still alive to get the answers.
And the idea that you can actually find a lot of serial murder from sexual assault cases, right? I mean, people talk
Yeah,
about, like, how are we going to find this? Go back through the untested rape kits. There's so much
yeah.
information there.
Yeah, as you know, it's a serial crime, and then it escalates. And so, yeah, you don't go around and rape a few people and then take a vacation. Like it escalates, and so the longer it takes, the more suffering compounds for the families. But then you're putting future people at risk, and it's absurd. And it's why I'm really excited, that Othram just in the last 2-3 years has really shifted to working a lot of active cases. And that's where you need that automation. If you've got a case from 100 years ago and you want to pull out the candle and the paper and jot the case by hand and draw family trees, you can do that. But in an active case, you need answers immediately. You need actionable intelligence that law enforcement can go act on. And so, in the Idaho 4 quadruple murders in 2022, like that's something where we were able to build a profile in days. It shouldn't take weeks or months to build a profile. It takes days. I mean, you can build it or you can't. And so then you build it, and then from that you have to develop some kind of knowledge about it. Where's this person from? Is there a certain part of the world? Is there a certain state? Is there a certain major family they're from? How far can you narrow it so that the police officers that are working just as diligently, in that case, there were 19,000 leads that they were trying to sift through. Even before you identify someone with DNA, remember, DNA in 2026 is like the camera feed. Are there any clues that can help narrow the search for tips?
Yeah.
Right? You don't need to get the person's name to develop useful information to get there. It's like saying, I don't want to look at the camera because unless the guy was on the camera with a name tag, it's useless. No, it's not useless. You're learning things about, where he was, who he was, that kind of thing. So anyways, it's really important to rethink how we're using this technology. And again, especially in active cases, but even in older ones, it should be more of a day zero kind of approach, and not something you just do at the very end when you've run out of other things to try.
Yeah, and it's changes the way law enforcement looks at it too, because you're forcing them to be proactive, and the traditional response is reactive, where you wait for something to happen to do it. Now we're looking at cases where they're happening right now, and we can prevent further victimization, and that's really should be the goal.
Well, and detectives want that. Detectives have historically used DNA on the back end, not because they don't like DNA, but because, again, as I said, they generally need something to compare against. So they're obviously waiting to have enough facts to develop a hypothesis. And it takes a long time to do DNA work. And it's, in some places there are backlogs where it can take, 8 to 10 months.
Right.
So if it costs, a lot of money, if it takes a lot of time, and the success rate is very low and really only works if you can match against someone, then no, it's not going to be the first tool people use. But now that it's becoming a lot more straightforward to do, the success rate's really high. You don't need a lot of information up front to be able to develop information from the DNA. Then you'll start seeing it used more on the front end. And, I've not met a detective that's ever told me, I just like to look at this one part of the crime scene. They want all the information. And so when you tell them, look, I can get information on all the DNA, it's a hit. And I'll just point out, this isn't just for catching people. We've worked a number of cases, but just going to give you two ultra fast examples. In Michigan, there's a guy that was accused of murdering his girlfriend. She was found shot and bound in the basement of a home she was sitting at. And, he spent a decade in and out of the court system. And there was a cigarette butt that was found at the scene. And this came from the prosecutors, so credit to the prosecutors. When they're going back to retry this case, the prosecutor's like, look, I want to make sure I have all the facts. I want the truth. And we test the DNA in the cigarette butt. It points to a totally different person, seemingly unrelated, except they track him down in another state, and it's a long adventure. But in the end, they find out he had the gun that was used to kill her. And then he's since pled no contest, and off to prison he goes. Now, does that mean the boyfriend is fully exonerated? That's for them to figure out in the court system. But there's obviously another player that was invisible, because at the time, and this was a 2011 crime, they were unable to read all the DNA at the crime scene. That's why you need all the facts. And another one that's been on the news a lot is Tina Hines, that murder in Florida. It was in northern Florida in Jacksonville. She was found. She was assaulted. So she was raped. She was murdered, and someone tried to burn her apartment down.
Oh.
And her brother-in-law was in the room next door. Allegedly says he was drunk and passed out and fell asleep. Well, he got fingered immediately as the person responsible, and went to prison. And then the Innocence Project advocated on behalf, and he was eventually exonerated because his DNA wasn't a match for the crime scene. But then who did this to her? And we figured out the answer. It turned out it was the DNA mapped to a man that was a colleague of her husband, who was deployed as a serviceman and knew them. And so it all made sense in the end. But it's the testing of all the DNA at a crime scene that can be very valuable in both finding the person responsible and also exonerating or removing suspicion from people that otherwise would have their lives ruined by this. There's a lot of victims. There's like the central victim of the crime, then the friends, the family, all the people that have been looked at the wrong way. Some have just been prosecuted in the court of kind of public opinion. In Texas, there was a 1974 case, Carla Walker. We have legislation named in honor of her. They thought her boyfriend killed her. Again, wasn't the boyfriend. He was a victim as well. So I could go on for hours, but this technology is really powerful, but it's powerful at scale. It's like the U.S. postal system. You might tell me, I spoke to a group last week and they said that they hop on their donkey and ride over to their neighbor and hand the mail to them. So anyone can deliver mail. Well, as you know, mail doesn't work unless it's at scale. So you need the U.S. highway system, you need vehicles, you need infrastructure. That's what we need here. There's a lot of people now excited, and I'm thrilled about using DNA in this kind of more proactive way to develop intelligence and information from the crime scenes. But now we got to move to that U.S. highway system. We need essentially the highways that will deliver justice and these kind of informational clues to everyone everywhere for all cases. Like Joe said, there's way too many, especially sex assaults, that have just not even been looked at yet.
Absolutely.
And if you haven't looked at those, like where is it on your priority list to look at exonerations or post-conviction testing? Those guys are at the back of the line.
So two things. Well, first of all, you're bringing up so many things, and I'm like thinking like, could this help Andrew Dykes in the Peaches case? Dave, you might know the Peaches case, who was from Long Island, but somebody else was just indicted for that. So very interested in that. And I do want to ask about Long Island because it was amazing just to see. We had all these victims back in 2015, unknown victims, and we did all this work to try and kind of like this, real just gumshoe work. But then you come in and start solving. It's amazing. But before we go there, where does the name Othram come from?
Oh yeah, Othram is the name is a little bit of an inside story. So you know, in Lord of the Rings, in this movie and in the books, I took a different tangent, but there's a wall. You didn't see that coming. There's a
No, no, no.
wall that lines the city. And that wall is called Othram. It's like an impenetrable wall that keeps the inhabitants safe. And of course, we did not build a wall, but effectively, we're hoping the technology we build protects society in a similar way, metaphorically, anyways, through the use of tools that can essentially help identify and kind of remove from the general population people that are doing terrible things. And DNA is one of the first things we wanted to work on. But like I said, we've got far-reaching interests in helping organize all sorts of data, not just DNA data. And this is our logo, and you can see it kind of looks like a wall from the aerial point of view, but it's also the white space around a person that's missing. And it reminds us, so here's your little person here. And so it reminds us that the unit of value at Othram, like the smallest indivisible unit of value, is that individual that either has been robbed of their name because they're human remains now, or has been subjected to violence by another and has not received justice. And so that unit of value at Othram is that person. And so hence the explanation of the logo. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's the explanation of the logo and the name about where we come from.
Now, we Asian dough. We have been searching for who Asian dough is for years. Can you tell us anything about your work with Asian dough?
Yeah, we're involved in, you know, a lot of the human remains that have been found on that beach. I do want to point out not all of them are confirmed to be victims of the Long Island serial killer, but there are a number of women that were found, a number of remains, infant, this Asian male. There's tons of folks that have been found, and so we were called in years ago to build DNA profiles for all these folks. I think a good majority of them have now been identified.
Yes.
These are remains that were in terrible shape, by the way, and had passed through other labs before they got to us. And again, it's just, you know, it's a whole nother story for another day, but we built a lot of tools to specifically make the worst forensic evidence workable for these kind of techniques. It's a huge thing that in the early days, I don't think people realized would be required as a prerequisite to open the door to this kind of testing. But you know, I will tell you from the perspective of genetic genealogy, you know, people from East Asia, right? They're underrepresented in the genetic genealogy databases.
Right.
So, you know, if you've noticed that we've, you know, helped identify people that are of the European or African ancestry, and this one person from Asia still struggles to be identified, that's a consequence of the bias that are in these genetic genealogy databases. It's not an unsolvable case. It's just a trickier case. And I will tell you, like, just being European alone doesn't guarantee success. There's a case I encourage you guys to look at. It was out of Staten Island. It was a woman, she was on her way to work. I think she was on her way to work because she was wearing sneakers. And some guy like beat her to death with a hammer. It's like a really egregious thing. Happened in Staten Island. They had no clues. But you know, there was a long and complicated story there. So Northern Europeans are well represented in the database. But even like, you know, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'm from Staten Island. So which case are we talking about? Wall? No. What case are we talking about?
The case, let me look up her name real fast because I don't have everybody's name memorized.
That's okay.
I could listen to him talk for hours though on these
Exactly.
cases.
No, it's
Staten
fine.
Island. What case are we talking about?
Yeah, so her name was Christine Belisco.
Interesting.
And
We're
it
gonna
was
have to look at that.
yeah, it was Richmond County District Attorney's Office in Staten Island engaged us to build this DNA profile. It had been a complete struggle to get the DNA profile built, but we were able to do it. It was one of the earlier cases we worked, and then they teamed with the Bureau to do genetic genealogy and eventually identified her. And you know, it's wild. They knew nothing about her. There were so many, you know, like a lot of suspicions and guesses about where she was from, what she did for a living, everything else, and just figuring out her identity really helped them narrow down, you know, who she was. So I will tell you, you know, in New York, it's been it's been historically required to either work with a lab. This is true in medical testing, anyways. That is essentially certified through the Department of Health in New York State, or the case has to be essentially worked in partnership, you know, with a partner like a federal partner. Could be the FBI, And even there's been some innovation. The Department of Health has recently, based on some recent court rulings, revised their position. They maintain tight controls they should on medical testing and a lot of other areas. But they've said, look, if you're trying to identify a body, that doesn't need to flow through this way. And so I think you'll see a lot more cases in New York getting worked now because the pipeline to move this over is just so much smoother. And so now these agencies in New York are free to engage with us at scale. But we've worked a lot of cases in New York, more than any other group has, and there's been a lot of success. From Long Island, Staten Island, all over the five boroughs, upstate New York, just everywhere. So it's been really great. And by the way, some of these people that are identified, as you're hinting, it then leads to the identifications of the people that might have been responsible for their deaths. So it's not just a humanitarian mission to identify people and get them back to their families, but it's also a way to improve public safety as well.
Crazy.
Do you think, Dave, that the job that you guys are doing at Othram, and as this gets better and better in the future, that this will actually act as a deterrent
I was just
from
going to ask
certain
that, Joe.
crimes? Oh wait, sorry.
Yeah, no, good question.
Yeah, that's it's really the idea. When the New York Times publishes a paper and says, you've got to have 50% chance of getting away with murdering someone, that's attractive to the right person. You tell someone that you're going to get caught, every time, and then you'll find a different way to express your, aggression. I will tell you that, we worked early on a lot of baby doe cases, and those abandoned babies. It's a complicated case as well, and there are safe harbor laws, especially in every state actually, for the last couple decades. But Texas was the first state to introduce safe harbor laws. This is 1999, and so you can take your baby within I think the first month or so. I don't know the exact rules, and you could take it to a police station, hospital. And you could say, look, I'm not ready to be a parent. I don't want the kid. And no punishment. You just give the kid away.
Right.
And yet you see this continued situation in which babies are abandoned. And I'll tell you, the solve rate on those kind of cases is not 50%. It's like probably like, 1%. It's almost never,
Right,
because
yeah.
there's no baby that's in CODIS. The babies don't have any identifying documentation. And so there's really not much you can do with a case like that. Now, what do you do? And by being able to apply our methods to DNA tests and identify the parents, all of a sudden you went from basically never being able to identify the infant to almost always identifying the infant. And it's hard to believe that as that continues to happen at scale, that's not going to have an impact on the rate at which infants are abandoned. And I think the same will be true for sex assault and for homicide. And here's the thing is there's a lot more sex assaults than there are homicides. So I think, again, it's critical to get justice for families to prevent future victims, but also to deploy this at scale, which is why we're so invested in upgrading all the public labs. Because if it's not done at scale, it isn't going to scare people into doing something else. They're going to say, you know what?
Yeah.
I saw on the news that someone got caught, but it's not going to happen to me.
Dave, question. Take the case that like, and it's happened to me. I'm sure it's happened to Joe. The case that really like just wrecked you, that you were able to solve. The case that you went home and you're like, okay, man, we did a good thing today. What case is that for you?
I every case is horrifying. It's crazy as you look into these cases to see what people are capable and what of and what they're willing to do to others. There was a few cases, we obviously it meant a lot to us to help identify people in these real-time cases. And everyone talks about the quadruple homicide in Idaho, but there was a woman, Rachel Marin, that was murdered in Maryland, and the person that killed her was in CODIS but unidentifiable, ended up being an illegal alien from El Salvador. He had murdered someone in El Salvador, skipped town in that country, snuck into our country, injured somebody, assaulted somebody in Los Angeles, then ends up murdering this woman who is a mother of five. I think investigators find out he was running with a gang. He was having to, I guess, go through an initiation process. And knowing that guy was running wild, he was 23 years old. It meant a lot to know that at least he was done. Even if we're not at scale yet and we're not creating a deterrent, look at this 23-year-old kid that murdered this mother of five. The person responsible for the Idaho murders, he wasn't even 30, right? So these are people that are young and have a full life of crime ahead of them, if they're not stopped. And I can't imagine that you would commit several crimes and then just retire. Certainly not, before you're 30. And so these people have to be identified. Otherwise, they keep doing what they're doing.
Very impressive. Go, Joe.
Yep. Is there a line? I mean, we hear a lot about the privacy issues and some of these different things about, how is Othram planning on addressing some of those things going forward? Because to me, it's more important to solve some of these cases, right? But there are going to be privacy issues, and there are going to be people that'll be fighting back. So how are you planning on dealing with that?
Well, there's a couple ways we deal with it. We built our own kind of data system, and we also run Family Tree DNA. They're a forensic matching system. So we've built a system around consent, and people can pull their consent if they want to. If you find the right space online, you'll see a lot of activity. But that's a bubble. That's a bubble of people that like to post things online. As you know, in many areas, you'll see a lot of chatter online, and then there's like what's happening in the real world. And in the real world, most people that have offered, and consented to join these data systems, they're fine with that decision. I think most people are generally happy to help. They're not really strongly feeling one way or the other. I think there's a few that are very vigilant and definitely want to opt in and get all their friends to opt in. And then there's a few that think that this is a terrible thing. We do everything we can to keep the process secure. Again, because we build our own technology and we don't use other tools, we are able to be more privacy aware than any other company because we don't have to move. We don't use third-party tools. We don't have contractors. We don't have volunteers. We're not using other data systems. Like we have an entire kind of in-house stack. We can even do most of this process without an internet connection. And we sell software to public labs that'll let them basically do offline, comparisons and analysis of these profiles. So we've done everything we can to get that part done. Now, there are people that are just simply anti the police or anti the technique, and then they're going to use privacy as an excuse.
Yeah.
And I'm never going to say like, look, criminals and everyone, all the like, don't deserve some privacy. But it is a huge invasion of privacy to rape somebody. That's a huge invasion of privacy. And so you got to balance, killing someone's an invasion of privacy too. So you have to balance the desire to, do right by everybody. And getting a bunch of rapists and murderers off the street is a good thing. And it does not mean that you can do it by any means necessary. That's what the court system's for. Force people to go to court, show them what's happening. We go to court anytime we get the opportunity. And again, we've spent, years. This process could have been done a lot sooner if we hadn't spent years and quite large sums of money to rebuild entire data systems to be completely offline and completely secure. Genetic privacy is not a joke, and we take it very seriously. But we're not using this to sell clothing ads to people or to market on Facebook, right? We're trying to identify people that are doing terrible things in society, and they certainly have no regard for anyone's privacy or their life. And we're also trying to help law enforcement be more effective. The amount of effort and time and dollars that it takes for law enforcement to do what they do could be drastically reduced if we could help them and kind of narrow in the investigation, and that also is good for the world. So yeah, I mean, look, there's no such thing as technology that never has even one possible chance of being used in the wrong way. But I always tell people, doing anything is very risky, and doing nothing's even more risky. Like, what are you going to do? Do nothing and let people keep doing this stuff? Like, there has to be a follow-up to that New York Times article addressing hopefully this reduction in crime. So it can be done the right way, but simply throwing up your arms and saying, I'm sorry, there's a privacy concern, so we'll do nothing, is not the appropriate solution. Work with the stakeholders. We talk to people that hate everything we do. We talk to people that love everything we do. And we try to get as big of a room together as we can and understand and absorb as much of the feedback as possible and implement it. And again, like, I always get these questions you guys didn't really ask. Maybe you asked in the beginning. It's like, what makes your lab different? What makes your company different?
I did.
Can't everyone do this? Like one thing we really focus on is like, how do you build systems that can rapidly and cost effectively identify people in a defensible way? It'll never reach scale if you're violating everyone's privacy and the system's not working, right? So the idea is, how do you optimize for all of society while also making sure that you're not screwing over any individual family that's waiting for answers? And it's a tricky thing. And we do the best we can do every single day. We learn. If someone's got a valid, piece of feedback, we want it and we try to do better. But, all I can say is at least we're doing something. Something is better than nothing.
Absolutely. You guys are like the Apple of DNA labs, trying to create enclosed ecosystems. That's a good thing for me because, the technology works and people love it. Um, you know, I the Nancy Guthrie case, they're talking about mixed DNA. What are the challenges? We know that's not you, but what are the challenges there in terms of trying to separate out this DNA? How does that all work?
Well, the biggest problem when you have DNA that is composed of multiple people and you want to do something like forensic genetic genealogy is, if you think about the method, the idea is you build a DNA profile and you want to match it against someone that's a relative. And so your ability to see relatives is contingent on having the right DNA markers, right? So if I am looking for the relatives of Josh, but I mix, Josh and Joseph together, then I end up with a profile that's going to match nobody. So,
Mhm.
it's interesting because like in face recognition, there's a big concern about false positives, right?
Right.
Especially for non-white people. It's like you see an image and you're like, I think it's that guy, because the computer system has to make a guess. Genetic genealogy is the opposite, has the opposite problem. You're not going to get a false positive. What you're going to get is a false negative. Is that if you either have not enough markers, which some people are hawking tools that just don't have enough markers to do this work correctly. If you have the wrong markers, or you've mixed a bunch of people together and you can't properly separate them, then you just find nobody. And so the challenge is, how do you very carefully take Joe and Josh and untangle their DNA markers enough to where you could identify relatives that are likely to belong to one or the other?
Hmm.
Because unless you guys are related, you're going to get no matches. That's the problem with mixtures and this new technology. It's a solvable problem, but I want to go back and say again, like, does this process work and can lots of people do it? Multiple people are working on these kind of tools and can do things, but it's like saying, can you jump out? I'm on the second floor in this building. Can you jump out of the second floor and still, survive? Maybe, but it's a terrible way to exit the building. Like there are good ways and bad ways to do things. And if you want to be able to work cases in real time with very small amounts of DNA, with uh, mixed samples, degraded samples, like the thing you're using off the shelf might work for like DNA that has lots of quantity and is fresh and everything else, but it may not work in these kind of areas where you've got these kind of fringe cases. And that's the reason why forensic labs exist. I mean, why do you even have a forensic lab? If DNA was just DNA, you could send it anywhere. You could send it to any place, send it to LabCorp, send it to anywhere, and they should be able to run it and get a result. Forensic labs exist because forensic DNA is in terrible shape. And the requirements right now to do the technique we do, especially for mixtures, can be more complicated. The testing that we do is very sensitive. It'll pick up anything. So it's sensitive, which is good. You don't need a lot of DNA, but then it's also kind of bad because if you don't need a lot of DNA, a small amount of contamination can be really challenging. So, anyways, these things have to be done the right way. We've worked a lot of real-time cases. We're not working that real-time case. I hope there's DNA, and if there's any left at the end, we'd love to look at it.
I'm going to make a baseball reference for you, Dave. What inning of a ball game are we in right now with the technology that you're starting to use?
I think we're halfway there. There's this thing called the technology adoption curve, right?
Yeah.
Everything starts out as a toy, like the internet. The internet's just like a toy. No one's ever going to really use it. No one would ever put a credit card on the internet. And then it goes through this like hype phase where like, the internet will solve every problem for everyone everywhere. AI went through this when I was in the university, about what, 15 years ago. AI was going to cure every disease. The IBM had this system called Watson. You can
Watson.
look it up. It
Yeah,
was
yeah,
going to
yeah.
answer every question that every scientist ever had, and it
Yeah.
was a load of crap. It didn't work at all. And then you kind of go through this reconciliation phase because the technology is neither a toy and worthless, and it's also not like the cure all. And then what happens is it begins to normalize. People kind of adopt it in different levels. So first you'll have people that are the early adopters and like, you know what? I need answers. I got this family, they're hurting. I want answers. That's
Mhm.
the early adopters. Then you got the people in the middle. They're going to be like, okay, your tool's cool, but I'm going to only use it as a last resort when everything else fails. And then eventually you just get to the point where like, wait, this is actually faster and cheaper. So if I have limited budgets or I have limited time, I'm going to use it. And then eventually it just becomes a tool everyone uses. So that's kind of the adoption curve. And we that's all technology. It's not specific to DNA.
Yeah.
And we've done that here with with this kind of technology. We've rode the curve on all sides. When I started the company, everyone thought we were stupid and this was going to be a passing fad. Now we're at the part where everyone's saying, yeah, now everyone's saying we're stupid because anyone can do it. So see, you're always stupid when you build technology, either because what you're doing is impossible or what you're doing is obvious. And then the reality is somewhere between impossible and obvious is where technology really lives. And that's what we're trying to do. And we want to build the technology, like I said, not just for ourselves, but at scale, which means that every public lab will need to upgrade. There's a couple hundred public labs. They'll need software systems that can communicate with each other, share information. I mean, there are cross jurisdictional conflicts that could be resolved through better communication. And then, frankly, not for the purpose of this call, and I know we got to wrap up, but it's like, what are the other things we can do to help law enforcement? There are case files. We're working with an agency that has 1,000 case files that have never been digitized. So we've got these boxes of VHS tapes, the little mini audio cassettes from the recordings.
Yeah. I know that well.
It looks like a Rand McNally atlas, but it's like a gigantic polygraph that's like, you could wallpaper your house with. All these things need to be digitized, put into a computer system. And so we have a tool called Othram OS that can integrate all that data and help, again, speed up decision making. And we actually just solved the case. This is a true story. It'll be on the news at some point. It's in Texas, but I don't want to out the agency. In Texas, we solved a case where using a combination of DNA testing and the digitization of this case file, we were able to instantly draw the connection and say, look, not only is this guy's DNA, but he was right there in your report, which you didn't know about because it was in a musty box in the closet and no one had digitized it. So that's another thing we want to help out with as well, is like, we want to move away from matching, right, to how can we learn as much as we can from the DNA. And the technical term for this is inference. So you'll see a lot of our messaging, we talk about identity inference. We're inferring instead of matching. And that inference ties in the DNA data, the family trees, whatever public records you have. But it's also the case files and all the other information. What are all the other terrible things that happened in this area at that time? Are there other victims from unrelated cases that seem to have similar MOs? And maybe they are related. This is very timely discussion, for example, for the Long Island serial killer case. So many women murdered on that stretch of beach. And how do they cluster? Are they all his victims? Only some? How do you figure out who goes with who? We have something similar in Texas, the Texas killing fields, where you've got a number of victims. But was it one guy that killed them all? No, it's probably multiple folks. How do you untangle that? So there's a lot of work to do. But the exciting thing is, like I said, law enforcement is very excited about these tools, and they're exploring them, and then at the responsible rate adopting them, and then we're very eager to take them to court and defend them.
Well, it was interesting. You said digitizing. That's what theoretically solved the Long Island serial killer case, was the fact that they actually digitized those files. I wonder
Yes.
how many crimes you could solve because you actually digitize and have somebody.
Yes.
I mean, basically, you're using AI to go against to basically look through linkage blindness, right?
Yeah, and it's not using the AI to replace the person, right? What it's doing is like I always tell people this is like, it's not artificial intelligence, it's like amplified intelligence. What this is doing is allowing you to do at scale what no human could do. There's no human that's going to look through 1,000 cases and piece them together. So you might as well get a computer to pre-process that and then put the human in the loop at the end and say, okay, Mr. Human, what do you think of this? You're trained, you have a detective background. What do you think of this? But telling them, well, here's a bunch of boxes, go sort it out. It's ridiculous. So as much of the manual process as we can, partition and kind of push away to computers, the better. Let the detective do what they're supposed to do, which is investigate. And we even have software tools that will read the DNA reports. Like why is a detective trying to figure out if this report has DNA that can be used for forensic genetic genealogy? Like that's not their skill set. It's not what they want to do. So we've built tools now that largely automate the ingestion of these DNA reports and tell you what questions to ask of Othram or your crime lab to figure out what evidence is available, what evidence looks most promising for the technique based on the thousands of cases that we've worked. because it's not a guess anymore. One small gripe is like people are like, this is a new field. It's new relative to, I guess, psychological profiling from the FBI, because that's been around, for half century, but it's not new. I mean, our company alone has been around for almost a decade. Like, this is not new anymore. And we need to deploy this in a increasingly more efficient way so people can benefit from it. And we've learned a lot in 10 years. We publish a lot of papers in peer-reviewed scientific journals, do everything we can to create that transparency so others can learn and make decisions as well. We love the technique, but we don't want to send DNA to its death. My wife, Kristen, she calls it the DNA dead end, right? Where you take DNA, send it off somewhere, and they don't know if it'll work, so they run it. The DNA is gone, and now you're screwed. The case is over. Because that's the only time a case is really, going to be hard to solve, is if you don't have DNA at all, or you've consumed it, and now you're out of evidence. That's the real tragedy. But anyways, it's a really cool technique. The work we do is more predictive. We can have better chance of predicting success up front than you can even with CODIS testing. It's really nice. So you can sample a small amount of the evidence, evaluate if it's likely to be a good candidate, and then use it. And if not, turn the evidence away. Tell people to come back in 6 months or when the technology is improved. It's been improving very, very quickly.
One of the things that I don't know if you remember, Dave, when I interviewed you, was actually going on 4 years ago now when we wrote the book, the Cold Case Handbook. And you had said back then, digitizing cold cases is going to be the way things are going. And here we are. And I wrote that in there. We added that. And here we are.
You were on the right side of history.
There you go. But what I'm saying is, like now with the artificial intelligence, or I wrote it down, you said amplified intelligence. This is also an opportunity to discover companion cases in regards to serial killers and sex offenders and everything else that goes along with it. The question that comes down to is, how does a city like New York, who have tens of thousands of open cases, how do we get them all digitized? That's the massive problem.
It's honestly, it's very straightforward. Every person that is, in New York, every resident of New York needs to make this an issue for themselves and needs to go talk to their representatives and to their senators and say, I care about this issue. Because you know how they are. The representatives and the senators, they want to get reelected. They care about what you care about. They're gonna respond to their constituents. So send them a message. And nowadays you can do it electronically, and they're required to look at all the feedback that they get. Send them a message and tell them, this is an important issue for me. I don't want to have a bunch of unidentified bodies. I don't like people running around sexually preying on others and not getting caught. So that's the first step. The second step is that, we do a lot of policy work in New York and also at the federal level and across other states. There was a case. I'll pull it up, but I'll just finish telling you. We do legislative work directly with the members to make sure that they're making sure to capture funding where possible for their state or for their agencies. The other thing that we're doing is trying to push legislation and support legislation that comes from the public labs, that comes from others, that says, you know what, you have to eventually evaluate a case. I mean, I know it sounds kind of obvious, but it's like, if there's no requirement to reevaluate cases and there's no timeline and there's no definition of what reevaluating means, then it's hard to push things forward. Imagine if there was legislation that said, hey, once you've been in CODIS this many times, we probably need to figure out who you are. I mean, personally, I feel like if you're in CODIS once, probably need to know who you are. But like, how many people should you be able to rape before they say, okay, we're going to now use another tool other than CODIS? And if you frame it that way, it's gonna, I don't know any senator or representative is going to be like, well, let me do them. Like, they're going to be like, okay, let's get them. So, but the thing is, a lot of the representatives and senators don't know about this problem. They don't know. It's the CSI effect. They're watching TV and they're like, by the end of the 40-minute, episode, they'll find the guy that did it. So this is why the New York Times article, I think, was so valuable, is it really shined a light on the fact that the success rates are actually very, very low. And if there's new crime every year, then you can imagine if 50% of crimes are unsolved, hypothetically, and there's some amount of crime every single year, you're compounding a tremendous amount of unsolved crime. Yeah. So people can make it an issue. We're trying to make it an issue. We're trying to get folks to make it an issue for, like requirements. Like, what are the minimum requirements? You have to set your expectations a little bit higher, and these cases will get solved.
Well, is there any legislation that look, we've got, 1,200 people watching. Is there any legislation or things that you can have all these people who are watching and love what you're doing, that they can do?
Right now, here's a perfect example. I told you about this girl, Carla Walker. She was a high school cheerleader murdered a half a century ago in Fort Worth, Texas. We found her killer, actually brought him to justice, and he died in prison recently. Um, we have legislation named in her honor. It's called the Carla Walker Act. And the Carla Walker Act. So here's another cool story for you guys. So there's a lot of forensic dollars out there, and most of them can only be used for the conventional forensic techniques. So we supported some legislation, and this is legislation that's been supported by private labs, by public labs, the Innocence Project. Everyone has rallied around this act, the Carla Walker Act. And what it basically says is we need to determine, is this technology, legit or is it not? And the way you do that is you do a pilot, and it contemplates a very small pilot, 4 years. It's like $10 million a year, so a total of $40 million. It's so tiny you can't even see it on the DOJ budget. And this $40 million, half of it would be spent on allowing detectives to get immediate relief to work their cases, and half of it is for the public labs to upgrade their hardware so they can start doing this technology in-house. So you can both see if the technique works for you and then also permanently onboard it yourself. It's like you could imagine, like, what is the negative of such legislation? And it requires you to report how you spend the dollars. Here's the big thing: it's outcome based. So it's like they don't care what method you use. You can use any method, any company, anything you want. But in the end, the question is, how much money did you take from this act? How much money did you take that ends up getting authorized? And how many identifications did you make? And then you have to report that back to Congress so they know.
Is this state or is this federal?
This is federal. This is federal.
So we could all write in and say we support the Carla Walker Act.
Yeah, and we need people to we need more and more members. The more the better. This was introduced in the House and in the Senate. It's introduced bipartisan, both in the House and the Senate. And so it doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat. There's tons on both sides that are supporting this, and we need more members to sign on and to make it an issue, because it'll go through the Judiciary Committee, and they're going to say, do people care? And if a lot of members say I care, which they're going to say that if their constituents care, then it'll get done.
We have a job now.
Oh,
yeah, we got a job. Excellent.
We have a job.
Yes.
Yeah. Well,
yes. Carla Walker Act is the simplest way. Is it the only thing? No, there's more things. We would like to see legislation that says, you're only allowed to essentially violently harm this many people before the time's up and we got to go find you. We're hoping that eventually converges to you can do that once before you get caught. But whatever it is right now, there is a small subset of people that do most of the bad things in the world.
Yes.
And a lot of them are in CODIS. So they're already in CODIS. They've already spent the money. They're in CODIS. They're in CODIS because their DNA from the crime scene has been uploaded. But now we just want to know, where who they are and where they are, and go get them. And so if there was a requirement that after some period of time or after some level of egregiousness that you had to be identified, and if CODIS couldn't identify you, not good enough. Find another method. It's like when you're a doctor and you're providing standard of care nowadays, like you can't try one therapy on the patient and then you're like, I tried one, I guess they're going to die now. Like your standard of care is like, find another approach, do another test, figure it out. Same thing should happen in forensics. It isn't, I uploaded to CODIS, there's no hit, so I'll just wait until maybe he gets, picked up at a traffic stop. Like the answer is CODIS didn't help. What can I do next?
Yeah.
And what you can do next with these kind of techniques.
Murderpedia? Is that
Solvopedia.
Right? Solvopedia. Solvopedia? Tell me about Solvopedia.
Oh, I didn't even know you guys saw it. All right, Solvopedia is
we do our homework, Dave.
Come on, Dave.
Okay, yeah, you guys are investigators. Really fast. Solvopedia is our attempt again at transparency, so you can kind of see what we're doing in action. I told you we built a system called Othram OS that can take all these case files, draw connections, interpret it, use open source intelligence to kind of enrich the record and look for clues. So we decided to apply that to a project that I care really deeply about, the NamUs project.
Yes.
The only other thing besides Carla Walker is like fund NamUs. I always say that because it's like the most underfunded project, and it's got outsized ROI compared to anything else that I've seen in criminal justice. Like identifying people really, really makes a difference for Americans, and it's just something we should be doing. But Solvopedia is an attempt to basically use AI and machine learning to draw connections between cases and essentially interpret all the available facts around a case. And some of those facts will be relevant, some will not, some will be real, some will not. So the question is, how can you use, as I had mentioned to Joe earlier, amplified intelligence to enhance the speed at which we can draw connections between these cases? And here's something I'll tell you really fast. In NamUs, there are lots of cases that are unidentified persons and missing persons. And I'm sure you guys know some number of missing people are actually these unidentified bodies that
Yeah.
have yet to be identified. And so the question is, do you need to send every single one of those cases to Othram to do a DNA test, to do genetic genealogy to find out who they are? Maybe you do. I don't think it's true. I think all of you guys know stories where someone said, man, there was this missing person that was like 2 miles away. Why didn't they draw the connection? They didn't draw the connection because there's a fire hose of information floating around everywhere. And so could Solvopedia be a way? It's an experiment, it's a work in progress. It's not a tool we use in investigations, but it's a way for us to show the public what we're doing to try to learn about how to use artificial intelligence to draw connections, and in the future you could imagine maybe recommend. So when you type in UP blah 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 blah, it's like, here's a case.
So obvious.
It's you know what, all the good ideas are obvious. It's like they say, if you can't explain your ideas in a simple way, it's not an important idea. All the big things in the world are trivial. The question is, like, why aren't we doing it? And again, we could argue about all sorts of things. There's some people on the internet and they're like, hey, AI is taking my job, and AI this and AI that. But it's like, there's a role for these kind of tools to make our lives better, and not just to make our lives better as detectives and investigators, but to like literally make humans that live in this country better, because we're able to give people their family members back and then track down the crime. Over 25% of the time when Othram identifies a human remains case, we publish this in the scientific journal. It's a true fact. Over 25% of the time when we identify a body, the cops almost immediately figure out who's responsible, and they get arrested and prosecuted and so on. So this is not like a hypothetical academic philosophical discussion.
Or is it
If Solvopedia, yeah, Solvopedia can help draw the connections so that we don't have to test, maybe we have to test 10% less things, saves money, saves time, and it helps get those answers to everyone. So anyways, Solvopedia is an exciting thing. Yeah.
Back in 2015, we asked Todd Matthews about AI and whether, and he was always talking about this. And we just had an interview that we did all the way back, rest in peace, with him. But
I really love Todd, and I will tell you a story I've not told anyone. But the week that he died, so we had been working for a couple months on a plan. So I had a vision for Solvopedia a few years ago, and it was basically going to be to take Doe Network and just essentially modernize it, right? It's a great tool, but it kind of has like a Craigslist 1990s feel. It needs to be upgraded. And Todd and I joked about it, but Todd was working on a podcast. By the way, if you haven't heard it, it's a very entertaining, and he's just a very colorful person.
of course,
And I miss being able to chat with him on these things. But he was working on a podcast, and I kid you not, the week that he had finished the podcast, I was talking to him, and I literally told him, I said, okay, you've run out of excuses. Let's go build this thing. And he tragically, it was like all of a sudden he passed away that week. And so I would like to think that some of the things that we're doing with Solvopedia, they're certainly inspired by discussions that I had with Todd. And look, like I said, there's a lot of people thinking about this. The question is, like, who's going to go do it? Hey, it's obvious that you can identify people with DNA. It's obvious that AI might draw a connection that you missed, or help you prepare connections to look at that you can't do manually. It's like, in my opinion, it's like we should have less whining on the internet and more doing, right? Outcomes over just labor. So let's go chase some outcomes. Let's go tally that. If you look at our Twitter feed, it's like 99.9%. Here's a case that was solved. It's not a bunch of lecturing and in kind of rhetoric. It's like, let's just go solve it. So solve every case you can solve. Keep developing technology that makes it faster and easier to solve cases, and bring this to scale. And we're agnostic. We don't care if the case got solved because of a detective, or because he also used AI, or because he might have used DNA. I don't care if people ever use DNA. We just want to build the tools necessary so that you don't have one option. Go to CODIS, it fails, and you give up.
Thank you.
Before we let you go, Dave, Josh and I have been talking about trying to do a like a crowdfunding thing for one of the cases on DNA solves and those kind of things, uh,
Telethon.
a telethon kind of thing, where we can try to get people to donate to a specific case to try to help fund it. So that's one of the things that we want to do in the relatively near future, probably in April, because it is DNA day right on the 25th. So
Right.
we're trying
Yeah.
to work something out and get that in there. So we hope that you can be part of that or give us something. We're gonna open it up to everybody in regards to we're gonna try to find a case and we want to try to fund it.
Yeah, if there's a
Well,
case.
I'm grateful. Look, you can't crowdfund your way to a better criminal justice system, but every case that gets crowdfunded is a really good data point. My wife Kristen, she'll go to DC and they'll tell her there's a lot of reasons, a scientific reason, a legal reason. Here's why we can't solve the case. And then Kristen will come with all the cases we've crowdfunded. And she'll say, look at these cases. They're from different decades, different geographies. The circumstances are different, and none of them got solved. And then there's only one thing in common. We put it on the internet, crowdfunded it, and all of a sudden it just magically solved. So it's very hard to argue that it isn't funding when that's the only thing that really separates cases that get solved and not solved. So anyways, I love what you guys are doing, and we're happy to suggest cases. We've got a lot of
Please.
cases we're looking
I
to
would love
fund.
Please.
I would love it if you could give us a case, and then by April 25th, we get that case
Done,
funded.
done. If you have a favorite geography, or if your listeners have an area that's fine. I'll send some suggestions, but there's plenty to go around. There's unfortunately more than 15,000 cases in NamUs.
Yeah.
So we're hoping that whatever it is, AI, DNA, whatever we use, we can get that number down. NamUs is not going to be a success until NamUs has no cases in it.
Well, we want a case that you think is going to help you move the ball
All
forward.
right. Yeah,
But
so very, very grateful. And I appreciate the time to chat today. I love answering questions. If more questions come up, please ask. We're all over the US. We're basically the largest provider in Canada now. We've recently deployed technology to Australia, and we're now in the UK and in greater parts of Europe. Like, there's unfortunately crime everywhere in the world, and as I always tell people, if the crime was committed by a human, and there's humans all over the world committing crime, and there's bodies that need to be identified all over the world, then we want to assist. So this is an American effort at the moment, but it'll eventually be a global phenomenon. And anyways, we just couldn't be more excited to be part of this.
Dave, thank you so much. The work that you're doing is brilliant. We've needed it. We've been waiting for what you're doing. So thank you so much. It was a pleasure to have you, a true
Thanks, Dave.
honor. And I know Joe and I are thrilled. So thank you very much. Folks, we're just going to wrap it up real quickly. If you want extended content on many of the things that we've just spoken about, please go to Patreon. We just dropped a whole bunch of stuff on Patreon. I can't even remember. I think we dropped some Cropsy music and a full length picture of my last film. What we've got coming up, we have Andrew Dykes, Joe, coming up on the 27th. I'll be going to Nassau. Laura Engel will be there. Raul will be there. So we're going to be going, checking that out. Speaking of things, I mean, we've got Tatiana, we've got the baby,
Yeah.
that we got to figure something
It's a
out.
little bit of a mess with area with that.
Yes, and I wonder what Othram can help us solve there. And then we've got April 8th. We've got Rex Heuermann. People are still
Again.
waiting. I think a lot of the work that Othram did has made an unbelievably checkmate case against Mr. Heuermann, allegedly. So we'll see what happens there. Folks, thank you all for joining. We'll see you next week. We're still figuring out where we're going to discuss. Dave, thank you very much. Please
Thanks,
hold
Dave.
on. Folks, take care.